And now, thank you, Brett, for being here so we could have this AMA session. So folks, this is going to be more interactive. So if you have any questions to Brett Cannon about all things Python, all things Steering Council, all things VS Code, even Microsoft if you're interested, or Gidget, as she's also making an appearance there, feel free to either unmute or drop your questions to the chat. We have this full half an hour with Brett all for ourselves, so we can take advantage of that.
Should I introduce myself, I guess?
Yes, please do.
Decides to be distracting in the background. So my name is, actually I'm at a Python conference, so I got one time a year I get to say this. So I'm Dr. Brett Cannon. I never get to use a doctor for anything. I live in Vancouver on the unceded territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. Yes, I have a PhD in computer science from UBC. It's actually where I met my wife. It's the other reason I always try to mention it at conferences, because it does not get me better treatment on airplanes anymore, or ever, honestly. I've been a Python Steering Council member since the Steering Council came into existence. I've been a core developer. It'll be 19 years come, sorry, my neighbors are being distracting. I've been a Python core developer for come 19 years in April. I am a participant in the Python Packaging Authority, although it's not really an authority. I'm on the conduct working group for the PSF. I am the dev manager for Python and VS Code, so I work with Karthik and Luciana, luckily pretty much every day, although no meeting Friday, so we still work together, but we don't see each other on Fridays. I know, Aaron, when they call for a doctor on a plane, I make sure to shut up. My wife has told me I can't say yes just as a joke, so I do not make that call. Yeah, I think that's pretty much it. So I'm happy to answer any questions anyone has about Python as a language, CPython as an interpreter, import, since I wrote the implementation of it for import lib way back when, Python and VS Code, although Luciana and Karthik can help with that, Microsoft, where Karthik and Luciana can help with that. I don't expect contact working group questions here. I can try to answer, but obviously you have to really watch what I say for that. Steering Council, whatever you want, basically. If you can think of some reason you want me to answer a question about it, feel free to ask. Gidget's left. You could, or otherwise you could ask about my cat. Yeah, Vancouver, whatever you want. First question from Madison. How frequently does the Steering Council do synchronous meetings? So the Steering Council meets once a week on Mondays for 90 minutes. We actually used to do 60 minutes, but the backlog got too big, although I say that having now, I believe, added the 20th item to our current agenda for Monday. Some of the items, I will say, take an entire meeting, and some of them take less than 5 minutes. So it really depends. We meet with Wukash, our director in residence, every other week for a half-hour update with him to just find out what he's been up to, what we think he should be focusing on, et cetera, et cetera. And then sometimes we have other meetings with people that we squeeze in, like we met with Lauren from the PSF for sponsorship 2 weeks ago. Chat with her to introduce ourselves to her and vice versa. Talk about what the Steering Council could do for sponsors and helping out with that and whatever. For instance, one of the perks of being a certain level of sponsor is you get to have a meeting with the Steering Council to talk with us, to ask us questions and such, and us to you. But yeah, so it's about 90 minutes once a week on top of asynchronous chats. Most of it's done over Discord. We have a private server just for the Steering Council for each year, for each term. And then we also have a mailing list. Jeremiah, did you have a question? Oh, nope. Okay. Oh, asking the thing. Do you have a complete freedom? What are your plans for lock files? Yeah, so lock files. For those of you who don't know, I've spent the last I think it's now several years working on packaging and Python as kind of a focus of my open source time. To be clear, I'm very lucky that it's actually part of my contract when I joined Microsoft. I was able to get 20% time written into it. But my management chain has always been very supportive of my Python time. So I probably squeeze 30 to 40%, depending on how much I just throw over at Karthik and Luciana during the week. Luckily, they're very understanding. So usually they're very happy to take on whatever I need to ask them to take on to give me more Python time. But in terms of the lock files, what that's in reference to is I wrote a PEP called PEP 665. And it was an attempt to introduce pylock.toml files for the PyPA world compared to Conda. And it was the idea of trying to introduce lock files because something I've seen, and I mean, it's something I also see within Microsoft, is supply chain security is a big deal. I know it's something no one will ever likes to think about or have to worry about, but making sure that you don't get messed over because some person accidentally takes a PR that has got something malicious in it, or we all heard what happened in NPM land with, was it color.js and joker.js. Some project managers just choose to do certain things that don't work out for you. I decided having a lock file was important. So I tried it, and PEP 665 was my attempt, and it got rejected, partially due to the fact that it doesn't support source distributions or sdists, those .tar.gz files you see on PyPI. It specifically didn't support them because from a supply chain attack scenario, source distributions are unsafe because you don't know what's going to get pulled in because it's actively executing code, and the code could do something different on your production machine versus on your local machine, right? Like you go, oh, well, today's Tuesday, so I'm going to pull in NumPy, but on Wednesdays, I'm going to pull in something not so nice or something. You never know. While wheels are very static, and you can actually check that they're going to have the same result on whatever machine you run them on. There was also a question of motivation behind it. One of these problems with supply chain attacks is, as I said, no one likes to think about it or worry about it. So it was a little hard to convince everyone that lock files were worth it. You know, the headaches of supporting them for some people, because if your workflow is unique enough to not really be wheel oriented, it would not work for you necessarily. So because the PEPs got rejected, I'm taking my wife's advice and I'm just going to do it myself. And hopefully the community will come along with it. I have a project called Mouse Bender, named after Mr. Mouse Bender, the cheesemonger in the famous cheese shop sketch that PyPI was originally named after for the cheese shop. Actually, if you get a 404 page on PyPI, it will link to the cheese shop sketch on YouTube if you scroll down, due to that historical name. Worries about pointy-haired managers was the reason we renamed it from the cheese shop to Python package index. Anyway, so I'm going to try to do it myself, but I'm going to be a bit more opinionated now because I don't need to try to get a PEP accepted first. And then based on that, which is going to take a while, by the way, because I have to basically make Mouse Bender almost a pip alternative that only works with wheels. But once that's happened, I'll probably take it to the community, see what others think. I will probably make us use it on the Python extension as the test case, because we have to worry about what we install for everyone who installs the extension. And then I'll just take it to the community, see who uses it, get feedback, and hopefully, and to be very honest, in a couple years' time, we'll hopefully still end up with lock file format in the end. Hopefully that answered the question well enough for you, Jeremiah. I'll take silence as yes. Okay, next question. How is support raising money for the Python Software Foundation going, and what strategies do you endorse for turning Python users into Python Software Foundation members? I actually don't know about funding on the PSF side. The Steering Council actually acts independent of the PSF. So the relationship we have there was actually before Eva, unfortunately, left us. Very sad day. Went on to her own endeavors. We had Eva sit in on all of our meetings for the Steering Council, and she was very nice to help us take notes and act as a good touch point with the PSF. But basically, the PSF doesn't ask anything of us specifically, other than potentially helping out with sponsorship stuff. As I said, have meetings with top tier sponsors. Otherwise, we sometimes ask the PSF for things like, hey, can we get money or funding for this thing, like the developer in residence? But otherwise, I don't really have insight into the sponsorship stuff. In terms of strategies to endorse to turn Python users into PSF members, honestly, just let people know that as long as you actively contribute to the community, you can become a voting member, and everyone who's a uses Python should just sign up because that's free and you just say you're a member. Like, it's really just one of these, just getting the word out. If tweet about it, talk about it, conferences like this, at your local meetups, at your work, just let it be known that it's not a big deal to join and it's free for anyone. And if you happen to put in enough time contributing to Python as a community, you can even get to vote on PSF board membership. And that's pretty much it. It's just let people know. Like in the DNI talks, hi Gidge, my cat has decided to attend. It was, a lot of people said like they just didn't know. So I think right now the biggest thing is really just word of mouth and just letting people know that, hey, this exists. Next question, PyProject.toml or setup.py or something else? From Damien. Okay, so that's a loaded question for me, Damien, because if you look at the PEP 518 that introduced PyProject.toml, you'll see my name as one of the co-authors. So the obvious answer is PyProject.toml. To be very clear for everyone in the audience, what Damien's talking about is historically, everyone, when they think of packaging in Python, thinks of setup.py. But the thing is, the setup.py is very much a distutils/setup tools now thing. It's actually not a generic standard for packaging. And it's just because the whole world has ended up kind of revolving around setup tools, partially for historical accident, just because first mover and just no one else came with anything else, is what everyone thinks about. PyProject.toml, though, is actually the standard on how to specify your packaging information. That's both what your build tool is, it's specifying your metadata for your project. It's the way that we are trying to move everyone towards a single standard so that you can choose what build tool you want to use and you don't feel like you have to use a certain build tool. So my answer is PyProject.toml because I'm extremely biased because I helped create it. And also because it's the standard that we've created for the community and hopefully where everyone's moving over to. For those of you who are still using setup tools, by the way, you can use PyProject.toml to specify setup tools as your build tool with it. So you can actually start using it now. It just doesn't support PEP 621, which is the standard that adds metadata to the file. I think they're looking for help to help bring that forward. But you can, even as a setup tools user, even with the setup.py, still use PyProject.toml and get benefit from it. Okay, next question. Phoebe's asking, are we going to have more PSF fellowship support for the Python Packaging Authority? It really depends on funding. Funding for the packaging goes to the packaging work group. If you go to pypr.org at the bottom, there's literally a donate button. People who sponsor at a certain enough level can say they want their money to be shifted towards that. For instance, when Microsoft was a visionary sponsor in 2021, we specifically said we wanted our extra visionary funding money to go towards packaging. So that's really up to the people who choose to sponsor the PSF for that kind of thing. Usually stuff doesn't come into a general bucket, although that's preferred, just for various US nonprofit reasons. If you get specific, the money has to be used for that, even if the PSF was about to go bankrupt, for instance. But for that to happen, honestly, it's up to the sponsors. John asked, do you have any suggestions on getting more time to participate with Python development at work or finding jobs that allow for 30-40% time? I don't know. I've been extremely lucky that in my career with Python core development, I started as, I was very lucky to be able to take a gap year. And my gap year wasn't traveling the world. My gap year was contributing to Python. And it was kind of accidental, but it worked out wonderfully for me in my life because I've gotten to be a part of this community and help it grow and end up in the position I'm at. And then after I got to do that throughout grad school, which obviously gives you a lot of freedom. So I got to do that. And then after I graduated, I went to work at Google, which has a 20% time program. So I just kept doing it. And then when I talked to other employers, I said I want it. And so I was very lucky at that point to be high enough in the community that I was able to more or less say, I want this, period. And I was able to ignore employers. So I come from a very privileged position. So I realize not a lot of people get this. So honestly, it's really up to the position you're in life. If you're able to ask this and really look for jobs that offer this, I would just ask, right? Like when people cold call me, I ask, like, how much free time would I get for open source? Or am I allowed to contribute to open source when I feel is to the benefit of the company, right? Like Microsoft, we have a general rule at the company. Like if contributing to open source makes sense, then you should just do it. So it's really asking the people you're talking to, can I do this, and making the case does this make sense? And I honestly just, when I talk to employers, potential employers, it's always the question of, all right, what are you willing to give me because this matters to me? This fundamental key reason you even want to talk to me is because of this, right? So because of that, are you going to allow me to continue to do this? So it's really, that's the only advice I have, is just be very upfront, asking what kind of open source time will I get here, both from freedom and also just contributing where it makes sense for the company. Next question from Phoebe. With over 200,000 packages on PyPI, which still blows my mind. I've been doing this long enough, by the way. I remember when you got all your packages from the vaults of Parnassus, which had animated GIFs of wall sconces of candles. And we all looked at Pearl's CPAN with longing eyes as, oh my gosh, I really wish we had something like that. So that's, the number still boggles me. Anyway, how do you deal with the name squatting, inactive maintainers and stuff like that? And stuff like tutorials that teach people to generate one-off test packages that don't translate into useful code. So the name squatting, there is a group who run the PyPI, and there is, I believe, a repo where you can open an issue and let them know. And I believe there's also an email address where you can say, hey, I found a package that's typo squatting, and they will take it down. And then usually once they take it down, they will block that name from being used so that that doesn't happen again. In terms of inactive maintainers, there's once again another policy. I forget the PEP number, but there's a process to go through to say, hey, this project's gone dormant. I would like to take it over. And generally the process is you can show that you tried to contact the owners. It has been dormant for quite amount of time. We're talking scale of potentially years, not just months, and that you are willing to take it over and be active. If that goes over well, then you can be handed the keys to the project. Obviously, you have to be careful because you can't hand over any project to anybody, because that's how you end up with things like once again, we've seen in the NPM world where people put in things that try to steal crypto wallets and stuff. But there is a process that you can go through. In terms of tutorials that teach people to generate one-off test packages that don't translate into useful code, yeah, there's not much you can do other than try to promote things that don't do that. Next question. Phoebe, should there be more moderation of PyPI? Well, so it's a balancing act, right? Do you, first of all, at our size and scale of a community, how do you moderate all of PyPI? Like literally the rate that things go in is so high that there's no way we'd have enough volunteers to do it. Now, that doesn't mean that we couldn't try to potentially use some AI or something to detect this. And I believe some of the funding that has gone to the PyPI is looking at ways to try to detect this stuff early on. Once again, I'm not directly involved with it, so I only have ancillary information. And if we locked it down so that every package had to be cleared, PyPI would not be what it is, right? Like if we started to gatekeep, it would not be at all the way it is now and wouldn't be the open place that everyone can go to, right? So it's a balancing act of how do we keep it open and accessible to anyone, even if you are not an active person on a project, right? Like, I mean, the point is a kid anywhere in the world can get their first project up and start getting exposure to open source, right? And if we started to gatekeep, I don't know if that would still work. But I do get the point that there's questions of how best to manage it so that bad actors don't ruin it for all of us. But the packaging work group, I believe, is working on it. It has some sponsorship money to work on it. I would reach out to them if you want more concrete answers, but it's obviously a well-known problem and something that people are actively looking at. Question from Mike. Any decentralized Python projects you think are interesting or you would recommend? Not quite sure what you mean by decentralized. So I don't quite know how to answer that, Mike, in terms of if you're talking about like somehow, sorry, my brain's thinking decentralized networking or something like peer-to-peer, or if you're talking about decentralized as in not controlled by a single entity. Interesting, or you would recommend. I don't know. The other question is it more around would I recommend to use or to contribute to, or just kind of whatever? So I'm going to take this as whatever I want to say. I don't know. Honestly, a lot of my time goes straight into projects that I help maintain myself. So I don't honestly get a ton of exposure to outside projects. I mean, usual thing that I tend to promote is things like HTTPX which was started by former maintainers of requests, which I think has been able to take a fresh view of how to do a nice HTTP library. I think it's something to seriously consider over requests these days because of the way it's structured. So HTTPX is a great thing. Yeah, I don't know. That's such an open-ended question. It's really hard to answer. Honestly, my brain right now is focused on WebAssembly. For those of you who don't know, some of us on the core team are working towards trying to get Python compiling to WebAssembly, both to have it in the browser, have it work with Node, and to also have it work with what's called WASI, which is self-contained binaries written WebAssembly. It's kind of big in the Rust community. Actually, if you go to, I'll type it in the chat. The work's all being done on GitHub under Ethan Smith's org for now, but we're upstreaming as much as we can. If you go there, the link on that repo actually has a link to what we've been able to do. We're actually getting the main branch on CPython to compile straight to WebAssembly. And there's a link to a web page that Ethan hosts that will pull up a REPL right in the browser and work. And it's Python 3.11 Alpha 4. And it's, we're a couple of us, Christian Himes, Ethan Smith. I'm kind of there to, I don't really get to code on it. I'm acting as management in a way on this, kind of almost like Luciano acting as a PM. I mean, the big contribution I did recently was fix something for GitHub Actions. True management. Anyway, it's great, and we're working towards it. And honestly, I have some hopes that we'll be able to not only get this so that all this edge computing stuff that people are doing that rely on WebAssembly will be accessible to us, but also hoping that we'll be able to use this stuff for like the docs, right? It'd be great to have executable documentation in the tutorials so you can actually try out the examples and play around and have it available right there. So I think there's some great opportunities there. That's really where my head is in terms of excitement. There's a lot of other stuff like the log files that were mentioned earlier and a bunch of other, was it pokers in the fire? Is that the phrase? A lot of other things I have going, but WebAssembly is probably the one I'm most excited about. Partially because, I mean, to be selfish, we also want it for work because we'd love to have it on github.dev and in the VS codes that we can make it easier for people to get started with Python. Phoebe asks, maybe too specific, but if a for-profit company is not maintaining its SDK, which is hosted on PyPage, does this still apply? Probably not, but you can try asking. It doesn't hurt to ask, and you can see what they say, but it might be a bit hard to convince the people who are in charge of PyPI to say, hey, a company who owns, may even have a copyright on the name, are not doing this, and please hand me the keys. But you can ask, see what they say. I already answered Aaron's question, so that's awesome. Most interesting applications for WebAssembly and WASI. So Python in the browser is one thing, both just as a teaching tool, but also potentially you can honestly write potentially web apps with it. It's at 5 megs right now of a download, so it's not small, but let's be honest, a lot of websites have gotten pretty damn big at this point, so it's not that crazy. In terms of WASI, there's some very interesting possibilities there in terms of executing Python in all of these edge computing scenarios that you hear coming out of various cloud platforms. And it's an interesting alternative to containers because one of the things about WebAssembly, right, it was designed for the browser. So it was designed around a very specific way to manage security, right? So if you think about it, Docker has been used for that similar point. But if you don't have to have the overhead of the container and you just have WebAssembly, suddenly you might have really fast startup times, which is what a lot of the edge compute people are touting, and good security. So from that perspective, it gets us into the same place where you're hearing more of Rust and all these JavaScript and all these other languages being used because it's all WebAssembly based. So even from a cloud perspective, I think it's very interesting for security. That's basically it. After that, there's the point of potentially working on phones more, right? Because every phone's got a browser, which means every phone has a JavaScript engine, which means every phone's got a WebAssembly engine now. So this might also be a way for us to solve the mobile problem that Python has. So yeah, I think there's a lot of potential opportunities there if we can get this to work well. The real trick is obviously going to be third-party packages that are written in C. But yeah, even if we honestly just got the documentation of executable examples, I think that's a great point. And as Damien pointed out, you could actually use this in Electron apps. So you could potentially use Python with WebAssembly as a way to distribute an Electron app and have it all written in Python versus having to ship Python to the platforms. So that is another thing that potentially gets opened up with this. So there's a lot of options. Basically, anywhere there's JavaScript's getting used a lot now. If we can get this working in WebAssembly, you could get Python there as well. I think I caught up on questions. Yes, Aaron's also excited about the edge, so hopefully that plays out. Yeah, like Days Labs at Microsoft's been actually trying to use Kubernetes to run WebAssembly loads and as a, I think the term's a kubelet or a pod. I'm not too much in that space, but like if we got that working, then we could use Python in that scenario and suddenly have Python workflows just scheduled directly in Kubernetes. Crestlet, there we go. That's the project. Thank you, Aaron. All right. Any other questions from anyone? As you can see, I will just ramble, so feel free to ask whatever. Luciana, did you have a question? I assume not, because I assume you would have asked me already, but you never know.
I have many questions, but I do divide them like for Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday.
That's true.
One of the privileges of working with Brett Cannon.
Thank you.
One of the many, I should add.
All right.
Yeah, folks, if you have any more questions, we still have a couple of minutes with Brett. Feel free to drop it in chat, unmute if you have just comments as well. Oh, we have a new one. Any advice for a new Pythonista?
Just try to be involved in the community. I mean, I'm somewhat known for the quote I threw at PyCon when it was in Montreal of, I came for the language but stayed for the community, and I think that's very true. So I would just get plugged into the community, however works for you, whether that's being here, which is a great start, and just chatting, getting to know people. If there's a local user group for yourself, get active there. Or if there's not, try to find one that's remote friendly that you can get involved with. I think the key thing here is just to be part of this open, welcoming, and inclusive community and help continue it to be that. And I think that's honestly the most important thing. I don't worry about people contributing to open source or how they or anything like that. I think the first step is really just, as I said, helping make this the community that makes you want to be here. So just doing that, I think, is the most critical thing. But that's my piece of advice. Anybody else?
That was perfect.
You're quite welcome.
That. Thank you, Brett.
Yeah, and you're quite welcome, Yanniv. I have a random question for the audience. If no promises, and I've not spoken too much about this publicly, so this is kind of a weird exclusive kind of thing. If I got the release managers to pre-build a Linux binary that was like in a tarball, kind of like what you would normally do if you had PyEnv installed on Linux to get an install of Python, would people like that as kind of almost a cheap installer for Linux? Like, I realize one of the problems Lucy and I run into at work with VS Code is how do we help beginners get ramped up on Python? And one of the problems always is how do you install it, right? You always hear people who teach people Python, like that's the first step, and that's always the hardest step. Now, I don't think we're in any way special compared to other languages, but it is a pain point. And we have a Mac installer and we have a Windows installer, but we don't have a Linux installer, partially because all the distros do it differently. So an idea I have is to try to get it. So if we can get a Linux binary that's basically compiled kind of like we compile for mini Linux, to have that made available, we could then have kind of the version of a Linux installer. Now, it'd just be a tarball that you can just drop somewhere. But the idea would be download the tarball on Linux, untarball it, and you just quickly have a thing on your platform. Now, this isn't to say this would necessarily this would not necessarily step on the system installs or necessarily be better than what you can get from your Linux distro. This is more just, I quickly need an interpreter on my machine, just get it for me. It's not going to necessarily be most optimally compiled or work with OpenSSL on your machine and be the most integrated, but at least from a starter perspective, or the quick, I just need to do local development. I'm not worried about perf in my Docker container. I'm thinking about trying to help make this happen. And I'm kind of just curious if people think that's a reasonable idea. So it's sounding like people like it, so that's great.
Yeah.
So,
you have a lot of upvotes already.
yeah, so once again, luckily at work, I'm more or less being told to make Python better for people. I mean, incidentally, it helps VS Code, obviously, but my manager and the VS Code team all up are very pro open source, just do what's best for the community, and we'll just benefit because we'll just support it. So I'm getting kind of supported to do that. So why not use Docker container that already has it installed? Was Phoebe's questions. Not everyone has Docker. Not everyone can actually run Docker. You have to think about some people who might be on very old, low-powered machines. Like one of the things we see in VS Code is we have people running on very old computers in parts of the world that just literally running Docker is just too much overhead, or downloading the container is too much overhead. If they already have a cheap computer that's running Linux, this would be way faster and easier. The overhead's way also lower, and it integrates more easily. The other thing is you can think about this almost as an isolated environment where you can just drop it down instead of creating a virtual environment. So that's why I'm thinking about this instead of Docker, because Docker is a very specific piece of technology that just not everyone can run. Yeah, as Madison pointed out, it's not for all solutions. I'm not trying to suggest that this would be an all solution thing. It's very much for the beginner just to get going, right? That's the other thing, Phoebe, with Docker. Docker is not necessarily beginner friendly. I still don't fully understand how to do Docker stuff. I have to go bug Aaron, who's in the chat, or Chuck, who's on our team, on how to do Docker stuff sometimes. So I would not view that as easy as something that, for instance, in VS Code, we could give a command to just say, hey, install Python. And we can just download it and put it down in the right spot, or just put it down in your directory and have it just work. So that's where I'm coming from with this and why I don't think it quite works. For MicroPython, it's a little different because A, I don't control MicroPython. I do get to have some influence on CPython though. The other thing is MicroPython doesn't, I believe it compiles to Unix now, but I don't know how compatible it necessarily would be, right? This is one of the tricky things with even WebAssembly is people typically want a system that will work with wheels and work with many Linux binaries. And MicroPython doesn't work that way for good reason, right? Not to knock them at all. They have their needs, and CPython has its. So from a perspective of making sure if someone was told, hey, first day of class, try to get Python working on your computer, MicroPython wouldn't necessarily work if the class has assignments that require something that MicroPython just can't run. So one thing, Tim, about potentially mini Conda is Conda the right solution for people? It doesn't necessarily work in every class because the instructions are not going to necessarily translate over just because they won't necessarily do a Conda install. While you are right, that might work for scientists. Not everyone's going to necessarily learn that way in their first class, right? Like I'm not aware of any generic computer science course that starts with Conda. Well, obviously I'm aware of data science courses that do. So it's kind of choose one. Once again, I also don't work on Conda and I do work on CPython, so I can at least tackle it from that side or view it as a gap I can fill on that side where Conda has a solution potentially for themselves, or with MicroMamba or any of those other alternatives. Yeah, as Chris said, Docker would explode his brain at the same time. Mobile phones, so Mike says, mobile phones currently don't have web browser extension capabilities. Do you think CPython WebAssembly or even PyDide may be able to help provide a solution? That's my hope. I haven't dived into it, but at least my hope is on most platforms, most mobile phones, there's a way to run JavaScript because they have some form of almost some web view. So my hope would be is if we can get a good WebAssembly solution for Python, it'd be no different than anything else running JavaScript. So I would hope it would work. And to be very clear here, the relationship between this and PyDide is what we're trying to do on the CPython side is just make it so Python can compile cleanly to WebAssembly, but it doesn't have necessarily the tools to build the scientific stack, much like PyDide does, nor any of the extras to hook into JavaScript with APIs. So that's kind of where the division of labor is currently falling, is those of us on the CPython side are just trying to make it so that PyDide doesn't have to worry about how to make Python compile, and they can then focus more on the packaging and the JavaScript API side of things. Victor says this might be a noob question, but what's the difference between what you are going for versus what is already available on python.org tarball, or would this be an installer for Linux? So on python.s, it's totally fine. The thing is if you go to python.org right now, what you can do is you can download an installer for Windows, both web-based and fully in the thing. You can get the Mac installer, and you get a tarball of all the source code. What I'm talking about is something that you can just untarball and just use immediately versus having to do the builds, right? Like if you look at PyM, for instance, a lot of people use for this. PyM downloads Python source code and compiles it. This does not even require a compilation step. It would literally just be a binary that you just basically unzip and it's ready to go. So it's even faster. So that's basically the key difference. Any other questions from anybody? I know we're 7 minutes over, by the way, so if anyone needs to go, I fully understand. But I can probably stick around for a few more minutes before I have to get going, because I actually have to go over to a friend's place who's just starting to learn Python the last month or two, and have them join me for PyCascades to help introduce them to all of you wonderful people. So I can stick for a little while longer, but I can't go for too long. Phoebe's question: would it have pip and be able to install packages? Probably. It'll probably come with ensure pip. I once again, you're getting ahead of me. This was just a gauge the community's interest and whether this is going to be worth my while to put the effort in. I've not gotten that far yet, but my suspicion is yes, we'd probably ship a pip or something in the box, or at least ensure pip, so it'd be easy to get going. But yeah, since the installers included, I suspect the tarball wouldn't have it. So. But yeah, the key point is you'd be able to install anything like anything else. This would simplify the VS Code remote extensions option for Python and on environment, or needs compiling. Sounds great. Yeah, so the remote stuff is a little different, right? So the remote extensions in VS Code are for connecting to things like a Docker container or connecting to a server over SSH or WSL. This would very much be more like local development kind of stuff. This is like, I happen to have a computer that's Linux based and I just want to quickly get an interpreter on it. Because once we have this, you then have an installer story from python.org for all three major platforms of Windows, Mac, and Linux. Because right now there is no Linux solution other than download the source and compile it, which not everyone's necessarily going to even have installed and available. So that's the key motivation behind this, is to be able to go as a getting started experience for anyone, right? I mean, I once again, using VS Code as a motivator, but it's not VS Code specific, to be able to fill that Linux gap, because there are plenty of people out there who do run Linux. I mean, for a lot of places, it's the only OS that they can afford, and especially that can still run on the hardware they have available too. So it does fill a gap for some people who just can't afford Windows or Mac machines. The Django folks have the same issues. We want to talk to some of the maintainers and others over in their ecosystem. Not sure, John, if that's in relation to WebAssembly or to the Linux installer, but if you can let me know which you think that is, I will definitely talk with them. Aaron said, you mentioned performancer. Would it be slower in any way if that got shipped in production? So yes, probably, just because it will be probably compiled for a more lower level target versus being able to necessarily compiling most optimized with the newer binaries of everything that's going to ship on the system. So my guess is yes, probably you won't necessarily get the exact same flags. It also won't necessarily be compiled for your CPU. So if you got extra extensions, maybe this is just me showing my age. Like I remember back in the day, it has MMX support, right? Back when Intel introduced those instruction sets. So I would still assume that anything that came from the Linux distro would be faster. But once again, there is no universal target for Linux. So that's more what this is for. Victor asked, do you have any suggestion on mentors that would be willing to help get started on contributing to VS Code? Not specifically, just because if you're talking about VS Code all up, you can always ask questions. So Lucian and I handle the Python side of stuff. We have a core side of the team as well that handles the actual editor itself. Everyone there is very welcoming and very helpful. I would just go to the repo. I can't remember if we have a public Slack anymore, but you can definitely just open issues if you have questions to ask, and I'm sure you can get answers. So yeah, I would definitely if you're trying to get involved, just have a look, poke around the code. If you have any questions, I would just ask. And I can't remember, as I said, if there's not a public Slack, just open an issue and ask. Team will happily answer as best they can.
For Python, we should always say that we also have the Discord channel. So if you have any specific questions there, Brett does take a look from time to time, and he can ask us to try to answer any questions there.
Yeah, I do try to answer any questions that come up on the VS Code channel on the Microsoft Python Discord. It's pretty much me. So you can always go there if you have any specific VS Code questions for Python. John clarified he was talking about Linux Star. That's good to know. As I said, this is a little early. I think I'm pretty much going to do it anyway, but I will definitely reach out to talking with some people over there. William Vincent sounds like someone I should reach out to. So I'll probably tweet about this too. So I'm sure various people I know in the Django community will point me the right way. But thank you for that. That's appreciated. Oh, perfect. Yeah, Victor was reading through how to contribute. Yeah, and if there's any documentation in there, by the way, Victor, that's lacking, please open an issue. We'll happily update the docs to make it easier to contribute. I'm probably over time. I don't know who's supposed to do GitHub.dev, but not me.
It's me, so you're great.
Oh, okay.
And when the topic's very interesting, I definitely don't want to interrupt.
Okay, any last questions for everyone before I hand this back over to Luciana so she can also show you how GitHub.dev works and she can show off the work of our Pylance teammates and the team she now is the PM for, help make stuff work just in the browser. So yeah, any last questions? You're all quite welcome. I'm happy I was able to come and answer any questions you have. As I said, you can always hit me up on Twitter. You can ask on the Microsoft Python Discord. I'll try to answer whatever comes up. I'm pretty accessible.
Thank you so much, Brett.